recording. So in one moment, we will all be seeing Kate's screen and we'll go forward with today's webinar. There we go.
Okay, excellent. So can everybody hear me? Everybody can see my slides?
Yes, I can see and hear,
okay.
Kate. Yep.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to be with you today. I'm really pleased to be celebrating the 25th anniversary of the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. During today's webinar, I will explore some of the changes that libraries have already made to provide better service to people with disabilities. Then I will explore some areas where libraries excuse me, are still experimenting, and I will address some of the sticky issues that we may need to continue to address in the future. I have allowed time at the end of the webinar for your questions, but if you can feel free to also ask a question during my presentation. Okay. And okay, so let me introduce myself. This is a picture of me. I'm Kate Todd. I worked as a librarian at the New York Public Library and Manhattanville College. I'm semi-retired now, but I work sometimes on projects that are of interest to me. I've taught face-to-face courses and online courses about services to people with disabilities, both at Manhattanville College and for the American Library Association. The last time I taught the course, Improving Library Services to People with Disabilities for ALA, people in the discussion said things like, I was born in 1990, so I was surprised to learn that ADA is so recent. I grew up with accessible buildings and seeing people with all abilities in them. ADA has been present my entire lifetime, and I've benefited tremendously. And I've taken ADA for granted as a given. So let me ask you this question, and you can maybe type a response into the question box or the chat box. Which is better, Joe, the question or the chat box?
They'll want to use the questions box to respond. Yep.
Okay. So type into the questions box. And do you remember a time when people with disabilities could legally be discriminated against in employment, education, and public services? And I see someone has typed yes. And sometimes when I teach the course, I use films, and so I see a lot of people are responding yes. They are not like those people who were in my class who have been born or lived with ADA all their life.
Yep, I'm seeing mostly yeses, a couple no's, but
I was a toddler when ADA came into effect. Okay, so we do have people who have, but many of them have lived through experiences where people with disabilities were discriminated against and did not have equal rights in our society. So when I talk about ADA, I do like to start with the things that libraries have already done and have worked for us. So I would like to go back to the 1990s and look up some of the first things that we did to bring about equality for people with disabilities in our libraries. One of the first things that libraries did was to revamp the physical space to provide accommodations. Ramps were added to libraries. Elevators were installed in libraries. Aisle widths were expanded so that wheelchairs could get down them, even though I see in this particular picture a wheelchair could go down this aisle, but I don't think they could turn around and go out face first. And accessible bathrooms were installed. This was, in fact, quite a expensive undertaking and required libraries to do renovations to their buildings or even to have new buildings that could be accessible. And I would say that a substantial amount of the 90s were spent in trying to get the physical plants more accessible. And if you look at the literature of the time, you will see that that was how people interpreted ALA as being something that required a change in physical plants. But also, at that time, assistive technology was being developed, and libraries were trying to find a way to get assistive technology into the library. I have a picture here of one of the early Kurzweil machines, which was a machine designed to read aloud to people with visual impairments. It was about the size of a small refrigerator, and I remember the prototype that we had in New York Public Library cost about $250,000. It had an extremely robotic voice, which would have been typical of the time, but it did provide access to books that some people wanted to have because they were not books that were recorded by the Library for the Blind Talking Book Service. It did require the person who wanted to use it to travel to the library, and we had one of these installed in Midtown, and only one person at a time could be using the Kurzweil machine. But it was, in fact, a great step forward in terms of the concept that technology could provide assistance to people with disabilities. At the same time, as computers for the public were being put into the libraries, other assistive technology, such as JAWS, which stands for Job Access with Speech, which is a screen reader that reads what's on the screen to a person who is blind, were installed in libraries. I do remember at New York Public Library that we did install JAWS on all of our computers, but any of you who have used JAWS probably know that it has a large learning curve, and only people who have really learned to use it either in a job setting or a school can really get the most out of it. Also, it was designed before there was visual access to computers, so a lot of the symbols are keyboard symbols that people need to use. Another change that came about during the 90s, although it didn't have as big an effect on libraries, was that closed captioning was added to all television sets. In the United States, a law was passed requiring that any set sold after July 1, 1993 would have to have closed captioning. Closed captioning provides words similar to subtitles on the TV screen, which is an aid to people who have difficulty hearing. By the end of that decade, by the end of the 90s, when the year 2000, libraries had made changes to their physical plants, had accessible buildings in most places, although once in a while I still hear about buildings that have stairs or don't have aisles that are wide enough for wheelchairs to get down. But librarians, when I started teaching courses at the beginning of the 2000s, reported things like, no disabled person has ever visited my library, or we spent all this money on putting JAWS on all the computers, and no one ever comes in to use it. So librarians had to really go back and re-examine what they were doing in terms of services and whether it was actually reaching the people that they were hoping to reach in implementing the ADA. One of the first things people did was expand their understanding of what a person with a disability is. The ADA has a very general definition. An individual with a disability is a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more life activities. Although this is a broad definition, initially people thought of someone as a disability as someone who is riding in a wheelchair. And in fact, the universal symbol for people with disabilities is a picture of a person in a wheelchair. And many of those things, like ramps and elevators, were designed to make it possible for these people to use the library. As librarians, we were used to serving people with visual impairments because the Library for the Blind has what was then called the Talking Book Service and is now referred to as the National Library Service for the Blind and Physically Handicapped, sometimes referred to as NLS in our literature. So it was easy for us to try to think of ways to incorporate people with visual impairments, such as by adding a Kurzweil machine or putting JAWS on all the computers in the library. I sometimes distinguish between people with disabilities where the disabilities are visible or invisible. So when librarians have told me that no one with a disability had ever visited their library, it is hard to know whether they had patrons with invisible disabilities. One of the common invisible disabilities can be deafness or hard of hearing. It's not always visible when someone walks into the library in the same way that someone riding in a wheelchair or even arriving with a service dog would be. People who are deaf or hard of hearing have their own college, Gallaudet College, where they have learned sign language, and it has developed a strong community of supporters in that community. They often like to use libraries because they are well educated or want to be able to learn more about the world. Another disabilities that we began to recognize as falling under ADA are cognitive and neurological disabilities. Some librarians have reported returning veterans with disabilities such as PTSD, which is not apparent necessarily when they walk into the library, but only becomes known when behavioral issues occur. Also, children with learning disabilities such as dyslexia or cognitive disorders such as autism spectrum also are not visible as a disabled person when they first come into the library. It is only after a patron, family member, or a family member self-identifies that we might know that this person has a disability. So let me ask another question. What are some of the disabilities that you are now seeing in your library? Certainly, when I teach courses now, people no longer say to me that no one with a disability has ever been to their library. Autism is one of the disabilities. Developmental disabilities among adults. people who are blind, deafness, blindness, learning disabilities, senior citizens with frailties, low sight, which can be either something that senior citizens have or younger people. The librarian who works at the Kentucky Talking Book Library sees people with visual impairments. Hearing challenges, which again is something that can either be started when they were children or be something that develops in older age. People with walkers, very common, and also something that the ramps and the elevators have made necessary. Walking with a cane or using a wheelchair. And that's a good question. Would mental illness fall into another category? It is a somewhat different disability from the others, but it is something that legally would be considered under ADA to be a disability, and so would be something that you would need to find a way to deal with in your library. And I think that there are actually programs that Rails is sponsoring that have to do with this issue. So let's talk about some of the ways that people with disabilities can be made to feel welcome in the library. I think one of the reasons that people may have felt that those with disabilities were not visiting the library is that when someone came, they may have felt they were not welcome and didn't come back. But there are several communication techniques that we can use to make people feel more comfortable in the library. People First language is a way to help us interact with the individual much more strongly than with the disability. Try not to use the disability to define a person. Don't say that deaf guy that comes on Fridays, but talk about that person who uses a library and asks for closed captions on the films. Try not to use normal to refer to people without disabilities, because it implies that it is abnormal for people to have disabilities, and we don't want people to feel that they are abnormal. Avoid negative descriptors such as suffers from or is afflicted by or is wheelchair bound when describing a person who has a disability. When people come into the library with a disability, also try to follow communication etiquette. I know many people with disabilities come with a companion, and you should always try to speak to the patron, not to the companion, even if the companion is the one who's responding. Use a normal voice level, and don't use a sing-songy or childlike voice level. Do not finish their sentences. I know it takes a while to be patient sometimes with some of our patrons, but make sure that they have an opportunity to say what they mean, not that you're jumping in to finish them. And it is acceptable to say that you don't understand when a person with a disability has asked for something and you either can't understand what they're saying or do not know what it is that they want. It's perfectly acceptable to ask them to repeat themselves. Of course, it is true that some terms of communication can be offensive to one person and be perfectly acceptable to another. I was interested in this recent article that I found about the art of the one-sided conversation by a woman who has a sister with a disability. The sister cannot talk or make eye contact, and the woman writing the article said that when she goes out with a sister who uses a wheelchair, that one of the things that she actually finds offensive is that people will turn away or turn their back and say to their child, oh, don't look at that person, as if it was not a real person or not somebody that you wanted to interact. She says she would like people to say hello and even ask questions like, why does she rock like that? To which she would answer, that's her way of showing that she's happy. And she says it's really important, and I think we all need to remember this, that just because someone can't look at you or doesn't answer your question doesn't mean they don't understand what you say or are not interested in the things that you are saying. Another way that we as librarians have been providing service to people with disabilities is in our collection building. There are several important ways that we can and continue to provide these services. One is with the multiple formats that we provide in the library. Large print books, audio books, closed caption films, books in Braille, although these books can also be available through the talking book libraries or the libraries that are provided by the National Library Service. It's also important that in book selection that we select fiction, biographies, and films that portray people with disabilities as an indication that, in fact, disabilities are part of the entire life. Many people with disabilities or family of people with disabilities are looking for medical collections, and it's important that we keep up both with medical collections or also with important and reliable information on the web that provides medical information. And when creating reading lists or displays, it's particularly important to try to include books about people with disabilities, whether they're biographies or fiction, to again show that this is an inclusive part of our society. Here are a couple of book lists that I found this summer. This one, 10 Great Books About Disabilities for Grown-Ups, was written by Karen Wang and provides some of the newer books about disabilities that people might want to select for summer reading. And I actually highlighted the Goodreads list of best children's books with disability and accessibility themes, mostly because it has some of my favorite titles, both recent and older, on it. But there are a lot of good lists for children. Plus, there's an award, the Schneider Family Book Award, that's given every year to books for youth about disabilities. One of the things I do want to mention is the difficulty of building good book collections about people with disabilities is that unfortunately these books often do not stay in print. Even the award winners may be difficult to find after a couple of years, and people have said to me, oh, I wanted to do some collection development and now I can't get these books anymore. So it is particularly important in this area to keep up with new titles and make sure that you get them into your collection quickly before they go out of print. So now we're in to the third decade after ADA. What is next? I know a lot of libraries are experimenting with new programming options for people with disability. Programming for youth with autism, inclusive programming for adults, described and captioned film programs, and even making sure that new programming that is being designed, such as makerspaces, is accessible. Here are some of the resources that I would recommend if you're interested in pursuing these areas of programming. This book by Barbara Clipper, Programming for Children and Youth with Autism Spectrum Disorder, was published last year, and I highly recommend it. And there is at least there were 2 events on the list that Joe showed you about autism. I highlighted one that was on the list when I was preparing my PowerPoints, Autism 101 for libraries. And there are many ways that we can be planning for programming for children with autism spectrum disorder. One of the issues that often comes up is whether these should be separate programs or inclusive programs. And I don't think that there's a right or wrong answer to this. Sometimes programs are designed to provide a separate environment because patrons with a disability may feel uncomfortable. But sometimes it's extremely valuable to have an inclusion program so that children learn how to get on with other children with and without disabilities, and adults become accepted as a part of the community. Inclusive programming for adults with developmental disabilities is another program that is being offered by Rails this fall. I also like the Next Chapter Book Club, which is a book discussion designed specifically for those with developmental disabilities, and provides a way for them to not only become familiar with books by sharing them, but also to talk about their responses to them. It uses an interesting format, which is reflective reading, since some of the people may not be able to read. So someone reads a word, a sentence, even a paragraph, and then the person with the disability can repeat it. So that although this is a slow way of going through books, it provides both an opportunity for the patron and the other adults to be able to familiarize themselves with books. We talked about closed captioning earlier, and films with closed captioning are particularly useful. You may have read some of the discussions of Netflix adding closed captioning to all of their films and programs that they are making available. But if you're doing programming in the library, you can also get captioned films. Described films, I think we're a little less familiar with, unless you're one of those people who works primarily with readers who are blind or have visual impairments, because another soundtrack is actually added to the videos that provides a description of what is going on in the video. These films are somewhat harder to find, although I think that there is an effort to make them more available, and also by using the SAP button on TVs to provide the descriptions to people who are interested in having them over their television set. And it's always important to remember, as we provide new services or new programming, to think of ways that people with disabilities can be incorporated into them. This is an article from the University of Washington, which is one of the leaders in inclusive programming for people with disabilities, on how makerspaces can become accessible to people with disabilities. One of the things that's interesting to me in this article is that, as is often the case, what it helps one person with a disability can be a deterrent to another person with a disability. So although they took all the wires off the floor so that people with wheelchairs and in walkers wouldn't trip over them, the way they handled that was to hang the sockets from the ceiling, and some of the people who had visual impairments found that they were hung at just exactly the right height so that they were walking into them, which was not a safe situation for them. So it also shows the importance of being flexible, of thinking that you've made an accommodation and then proceeding to the next area to see whether that accommodation has worked and whether you need to go back and redo it. One of the areas that I think still needs a lot of attention is web accessibility. This is an article from the Wall Street Journal in the last couple of weeks called "The Challenges of Surfing While Blind." This author is blind and describes some of the challenges she had. A particular case, she went on the web and was asked for her state. Instead of given a list of all the states she could select from, she was given a map and was asked to use the mouse to click on the state where she lived. Of course, not being able to see the screen, she was unable to complete that task. In her article, she does state that 50% of websites are not accessible to people who are blind or visually impaired. And she said because of the fact that people like to rely on images, pictures, videos, that this situation is becoming more difficult instead of less difficult as time goes on. Certainly we as librarians need to try to determine whether our websites are accessible to people who are blind, visually impaired, or have other disabilities. And one of the best ways to do that is to find someone in your community to test your own website and make sure that it is meeting web accessibility criteria. I know that this often can be distressing because I assume the IT people or the web designers who made that beautiful website with all the pictures or the map think it's wonderful and don't want to be told that no one can use it because it's not accessible. Another area that's of concern is the closed captioning on the internet. We've become very used to closed captioning on the TV, and as I said, Netflix has recently added closed captioning to all of their resources. But on the internet, it's much less common, and more videos are showing up on the internet, so it's an even larger problem. This is an article from the New York Times in February that describes the edX program, which is the online teaching program of Harvard and MIT, and how they were sued by people who were deaf and hard of hearing because there were no closed captions available on their programs. My understanding is that they have now made an agreement that they're going to add closed captions. Unfortunately, as someone who's put closed captions on a lot of videos, I can tell you it's not so easy because the technology is still not there to make it simple. If you use, for example, YouTube to translate your speaking to captions, my experience is that about half of what I say is not correctly transcribed from speech to text. So you have to go back and either edit the transcription or upload a script to make sure that the captions are saying the appropriate thing that you want them to say. Again, I know a lot of libraries do like to use small videos or tutorials, and it's important that we start thinking about making sure that they are captioned so that they are available to people who are hearing impaired or deaf. I know many people with disabilities are finding that apps on their smartphone or tablets are providing additional ways to be independent and complete their daily tasks. Some use apps just to call a cab or to text message or email people. But there are also many apps that are specifically designed for people with disabilities. And if you have iPads that are available to people with disabilities, or even if you just want to highlight some of these apps for people with disabilities, it is another way to show what's available. I want to talk about a couple. These are some that I currently have on my iPad. The BARD app, which is the Library of Congress National Library Service app that provides mobile access to digital materials. It does require the person to have a National Library Service account and to sign in order to be able to use it. The Clear Captions Act provides mobile access to the telephone relay service for people with hearing or speech impairments. Clear Captions is only available to people with qualifying disabilities who have registered. So again, it's an app that requires people to get some kind of documentation to indicate that it's necessary for them to use it. The Class Dojo app, which I know is used in a lot of schools, particularly with students with behavioral problems, gives you dojo points for good behavior or completing assignments, is one that you may be hearing about from parents or teachers. Other apps on this list include VBooks, PDF Reader, which reads PDFs on a mobile device, Natural Reader, which can read a variety of texts, although you do need to highlight the text, so you need to have some amount of vision. Marley Signs, a app that can teach sign language, designed by Marley Maitland, the actress. Two apps that can provide communication, the Alexicon AAC, which allows the person to point to pictures and to have words or sentences created, and Verbally, which allows a person to type and then have the mobile device speak what is said, and Dragon Dictation, which is similar to Dragon Naturally Speaking, which you may have on your computers, which allows people to speak to the mobile device and have the text created. Also, there are a lot of other mobile devices that accept dictation and speech to text. So I think we have a poll that we can put up right now.
Yep, I will go ahead and launch that, Kate. So everybody, you will soon see on your screen these questions, and we just ask you take a minute to indicate how many of these apply to you, and we will give you all a second to do that.
Okay. And this is something I would like you to think about before planning how to improve library services to people with disabilities. How many of you have a member of a family who has a disability, have a friend with a disability, have a friend caring for a parent or a child that has a disability, have a disability yourself, or have never met a person with a disability? And maybe, let's see, we have and if you're in a group, you may have to poll the group and vote more than once.
And so far, it seems like those first three, we at least 70% or more, about 10%, 12% have a disability themselves, and only 1 or 2% have never met a person with disabilities. And I just popped up the results so everybody can see them. So there we go.
Okay, so this is as I would expect, that over 70% of people either have a family member, a friend, or a friend caring for someone with a disability. I think 13% have a disability is relatively representative in our workforce, although the statistics indicate that as many as 20% of people in our society actually have a disability. And it's always possible that someone has not met or recognized someone with a disability. So if you're developing a plan for improving library services to people with disability, I think the first place to start is with those friends, family, staff members, or current patrons who have disabilities. Talk to them about how they use the library, what they like about the library, what they don't like about the library, what they think maybe the library should do, although don't ever promise them that just because they've made that suggestion that that is what you will be doing right away. And sharing these comments in staff meetings is a good way to think about what is the next best step for you and your library. Also, in addition to using your own resources, you can develop valuable partnerships in your community. Some of you mentioned that you had schools in the area who had special education. There are specialized schools that work with students who are deaf. There are specialized schools that work with students who are blind. And there are still some standalone special education schools, although the goal is always to provide inclusion schooling for students in the public schools. If you have a library advisory committee, you may have someone on the committee who has a disability, or you may have someone who uses the library who has a disability that you want to ask to be on the committee. Visit senior citizen centers. I know several of you mentioned that you had seniors coming in who either were using walkers or had other disabilities that they had developed later in life. And these people often do not think of themselves as disabled because they did not grow up either not being able to see or hear. It's only something that developed as they grew older. So if you ask them, are you disabled, they might probably say no. If you have job programs in your area, they can be good partners, and in many areas there are now job programs which are specifically designed to help people with disabilities find meaningful employment. And veterans groups, I did mention that sometimes we have veterans who are coming back with a variety of disabilities who may need support in the library. Staff development is a key element for improving library service to people with disabilities, and since I assume 70% of your staff know somebody with disabilities, it's a good place to again start with what are the people that they know who have disabilities think that they need in the library, or what is their library experience. And there are several programs that Rails is offering, and as Joe said, there are additional programs besides the ones that I've indicated on this slide. I do want to focus on 5 common myths that people have about disabilities. First of all, people with disabilities don't want to talk about it. As that article I showed you earlier said, in fact, sometimes people with disabilities do want to talk about it. And I have talked to librarians who have disabilities who said, I want it brought out in the open initially, I want it discussed, and then we can forget about it and move on. If you don't talk about it, people are always wondering or whispering or thinking, what is the story? So don't assume that a person with a disability doesn't want to talk about it. Another common myth is that all people who are blind know how to read Braille. People who become blind later in life definitely are not likely to have learned how to read Braille, but even people who are blind as young people may not know Braille, may not have learned it, particularly if they are in an inclusion class in a school where there would not be someone who had the capability to teach them how to use Braille. So although there are a variety of ways now that we can offer services to people who are blind, don't assume that the only thing they want is to read Braille. Another myth is that people with similar disabilities want the same accommodations. In fact, my experience is that people who have similar disabilities often want very different accommodations. A person who is blind may prefer Braille, may prefer to use JAWS, may prefer to use a different screen reader such as Apple provides, and so each person wants a different accommodation. So we have to face the fact that one size does not fit all when we're talking about providing services to people with disabilities. That is one of the reasons that it's really important to get to know the people in your community, what their interests are, what their preferences are, and what kind of accommodations they want. Another myth is that all people who are deaf know sign language. One of the scenes in C.C. Bell's book, El Deafo, is of another child learning that she is deaf and beginning to wave her hands in sign language in her face. But C.C. didn't know sign language, so she was not able to find that a meaningful communication, and in fact didn't know why anybody would be waving their hands all around just because she had said she was deaf. There is a large population of people who know sign language, but again, I think as students are in inclusion classes, they may not know sign language, and because a lot of technology allows those with partial hearing to take full, to have a place in the class and be able to hear well, they're not as motivated to learn sign language. The final myth I would like to talk about is that people who are disabled are miserable and unhappy. Many times we begin to feel sorry for a person who is disabled and say, oh, they're really suffering, they have a terrible life. And in fact, this is not the case. Many people who have disabilities have found ways to adjust to them, to live with them, to find the things that they love to do, to have accommodations that allow them to be part of the world, and to have very happy and satisfying lives. I know that we all have ways of keeping up as librarians with what's going on in the world, and newspapers, radio, TV, but I also have found that there are these several Twitter sites that actually provide useful information and up-to-date information about what is happening in terms of services to people with disabilities. DisabilityGov is the official Twitter account of the U.S. federal government website, disability.gov. The National Down Syndrome Society is their official account and also reports on legislation that is being handled in Washington. The UCP National is the Twitter account of United Cerebral Palsy National Office. Disability in Kidlit is a group of reviewers who've been around for about a year, who've been reviewing books about disabilities for children and young adults. One of the things that I like about this site is that they actually try to find people with the same disability as is portrayed in the story. And sometimes their perspective is very different from the perspective of an official reviewer or even the author who wrote the story. And I like knowing about it. They have been going back and looking at some even long-established books about children with disabilities. So it's useful to try to keep up with their perspective. Renee Grassi, who I assume some of you know, is a librarian in Illinois, posts often about issues of disability. And ASCLA, the Association of Specialized and Cooperative Library Agencies, is the division of ALA that focuses specifically on serving populations with special needs. So, in summary, I would like to say that we have done a lot in terms of providing services to people with disabilities in the last 25 years. Libraries have determined that it was an important part of our goals and have developed a variety of things. There's still other things that can be done, and I do recommend that each library develop a plan, even just one thing that you might want to do within the next year to improve library services to people with disabilities. And
Okay. Well, as I said at the outset, you guys have found the questions pane. So if you have some questions you want to ask of Kate, we do have a little bit of time for that. So I'll give you all a minute or two if you do want to ask questions or even make a comment or mention something you're doing at your own library. You know, this webinar, any series of webinars on this topic that Rails is going to offer, obviously, isn't going to tell you what to do. This is too big of a topic. It touches too many areas, but it's for us wanting to bring awareness and to get libraries thinking about this. And I would say the other thing is that libraries traditionally do a great job of sharing, and we don't always have to reinvent the wheel. And there are certainly libraries within Rails that are doing a lot of great programs and services. I know later, one of our last sessions is with staff from Skokie Public Library, which has some great programs in this area. So also looking around to nearby libraries, to your colleagues, to see what they are doing and hopefully get some discussions going. So Kate, I don't know if you see this question that just came in.
okay.
But I will go ahead and read it to the audience. What are the acceptable ways to address parents concerning children with autism, other neurological disabilities, to get them to talk about what they would like to see changed or done with library services?
I think the first question is, how do you approach them? One of the things that's really useful is if you have a group, either a special education group or a group of parents where they're actually discussing the issue, either in the library or somewhere else, to be able to talk to them in that setting, because that's a setting where they would be comfortable. But as I said, not all people are offended if you ask about a disability. So the first question you can always ask is, would you be offended if I talk to you about your child and their disability? If they say yes, I don't want to talk about it, then you can back off. But I think many parents do have an indication, a feeling that is what they want to discuss, that they want to find a way to share with libraries the things that they need for their specific children. And I think one of the bigger questions which does come up is if they have behavioral problems, which some children with autism do and some don't, and to ask something like, do you think that your child would be better served by a specific program that only deals with children who have autism, or are there other ways that if you're bringing them into an inclusion program to make it more comfortable for both the parent and the other children?
Yeah, and I'll add to that, Amanda. You know, as I said, we have a couple webinars in September that are specific, since you do mention autism in your question, that a couple of the webinars in September center around autism. So if you're able to make it to either of those, you'll also have some other people that that can also respond to that question. I might be able to show you some you know, experiences and best practices. Christy asks a question whether, Kate, you'd have any advice for libraries developing programs for adults with developmental disabilities. She says they're currently developing a songs and stories program at my library. And Christy, again, I believe it's in November that we will have a couple of staff from the library, not in Illinois, but they'll be talking about some of these things, about developing programs and specifically more for adults with developmental disabilities. But I don't know if you have anything you want to add, Kate, by way of advice.
Well, I would actually hope that you're working with some type of a group home or some other organization that that you could actually talk to some of the people with the disabilities and see what they like. So are they interested in books? What kind of songs they like, so that you can develop something that is appropriate for them. As adults, you have to remember they many times have adult interests, even if they don't read well or have the capability to write. They certainly, my experience is that they would certainly have strong preferences and adult interests. So they may be interested in music that's popular right now, or a show music, or something, books that are in the news right now, so that they could be incorporated in society. I don't know of anybody who's doing that kind of programming right at this time, although I did work with the organizations in Staten Island where they actually did read short stories and then have book discussions at that time.
Okay, and another question, Kate, have you come across any libraries doing programming or services for populations who have Alzheimer's or other dementias?
I haven't, but again, I think for the patrons themselves, despite the fact that that they may have dementia, they still have things that they're interested in, and being able to talk to them or talk to their caregivers would be particularly valuable to find what it is that they want. And even people with dementia may have strong feelings. If you read them some kind of a story and then ask for their opinion about it, they may have things that they really want to express, even if they are not remembering all the things in their own life that are relevant experiences to bring to that story.
Okay. And it looks like Nancy suggests looking at the Memory Cafe programs for patrons with dementia, which I guess is a program that they started growing in Wisconsin. So you can probably go online and find
Okay.
some information about that. As I said
I will
before,
try to
it's,
find that too, because it would
yeah,
be of interest to me. Memory Cafe.
yeah, Memory Cafe programs. Um, and another question here from Amanda. Kate, if you have any thoughts about the inclusion of adults with disabilities in children's programs that are exclusive to persons with disabilities, such as kids with autism, if you have any thoughts on that.
I personally feel that it's important to separate out the adults from the children. Um, just because adults have adult interests and children could be more interested in younger things. Also, children can be frightened by an adult with autism who hasn't quite mastered uh, how to interact with children in the library, uh,
Mhm.
or children at all. So my tendency would be to have separate programs rather than say, well, this person has a developmental age of 7 years old, so I'm going to put that person with 7-year-olds.
Mhm.
That's my bias.
Yeah. Okay. Um, I don't see any other questions. So I will say again, we've recorded this webinar. So if you are listening, need to come back to it. If you want to have colleagues who couldn't be with us today at your library or neighboring libraries, it will be up on our continuing education archives page within a couple days, along with Kate has provided both a handout, a PDF version of the slides today, as well as a handout that includes resources that might be useful for you. That will be there as well. Um, so with that, Kate, I want to thank you very much for today's webinar, and thank you all of you who attended and asked questions and participated. We look forward to doing these events as the calendar year goes on, centered around ADA 25 Chicago. So once again, Kate, thank you.
Well, I really appreciate being invited, and anybody who wants to get in touch with me, feel free to email me at the email that's shown on the screen.
Very good. Okay, well, once again, thank you, and everybody have a good rest of your day, and take care.
Thanks a lot.
Bye now.